Everyone, it's Jeremy Benamy, president of J Street, and I am coming to you from Washington, D.C., where the House of Representatives is just coming off of some late afternoon votes. So our special guests, Congressman Jared Huffman of California and Jennifer Wexton of Virginia, are going to be with us any minute now. So we will be spending a couple of minutes now reviewing the overview of the trip so that we can have the maximum amount of time with the members on their reflections. I wanted to share with all of you a little bit about the schedule, what these trips are generally set up to provide as a sort of a narrative arc. We will then hear from the members with some of their personal reflections, and we'll have time for open questions and answers in the last half hour. We're still aiming to wrap this up by 6 p.m. Eastern, so we might be a little bit more condensed than we might have planned on, but I'm sure this is going to be an interesting hour nonetheless. The J Street Education Fund, which is the 501c3 arm of J Street, runs an educational travel program that is named after a supporter of ours named Len Hill. It's the Len Hill Education Program, and through that program, we run both trips for members of Congress, but also other educational travel programs, including congressional staffers, other politically significant and influential people to go over to Israel and Palestine and to get a firsthand view of the facts on the ground and to get an in-depth grounding and briefing in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. When I pitch the trips to members of Congress and other potential participants, what I say is that this is not your ordinary introductory visit to Israel. This is a graduate level seminar in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I'm pleased to see that we've joined by Congressman Jared Huffman. And Congressman, I was just about to give a quick overview of the schedule because I said I was killing time, waiting for you to join us. At which point, exactly. So the bridge just got a lot shorter. It's no longer the bridge to nowhere. It's the bridge to you. So I'll just quickly say that these trips, which are at a real serious level of in-depth examination of the conflict, are not intended to be a sort of intro to Israel or a 101 visit to fall in love with the land and to, sort of see the sights. This is really an opportunity to look at this ongoing conflict up close, to see the facts on the ground, to understand issues that are talked about in Washington and in our communities in a very political way and often in an abstract way. But this is a trip that allows you to see those issues like Jerusalem, the question of, is it a unified city? Is it a divided city? You can debate that all you want in Washington, D.C., but you have to go to Jerusalem and actually see it and walk the streets and understand what the city is. So that's the first goal, is to see the facts on the ground. The second is the politics, that, we are a political organization at our heart. What is possible is defined by the politics of this country, and it's also defined by the politics of Israel and the politics of Palestine. And so we take some time to meet with political leaders on both sides, try to spend about half our time on each side of the conflict, and understand the political possibilities. And then finally, Congressman, you're an American policymaker at the end of the day, and our goal is to shape American policy. And I think the question that what ends the trip with is what can the United States do? What are the options for American policy? And so those are the three areas of focus of the trip: understanding these issues at the ground level, understanding the politics, and then opening up the question of what can the United States do. So with that as sort of a framing for the trip, what I'd love to do, Congressman, is turn to you and ask you to share a little personal reflection perhaps on what for you about this trip was moving and perhaps emotional, and what did you learn on this trip that perhaps you didn't know going in. And by way of introduction, people know Congressman Jared Huffman, I'm sure, from California's 2nd District. He's been a member of Congress now for 5 terms since 2013. His focus is very much on climate and natural resource issues, but takes a very deep interest in these issues related to Israel and Palestine, and has been a real champion of our point of view. So, Congressman, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And if this was a graduate seminar on the Israel-Palestine conflict, you were our dean or our professor, I'm not sure which, but it was great having you there to guide us and interpret for us, but also a lot of other just remarkable experts and scholars. The breadth of what we covered and what we learned about was remarkable. And I think just one of the real features of this trip, and one of the reasons I will recommend it to all of my colleagues. So I have done the Fall in Love with Israel trip. I've done 2 of those, and it's great. I'm there. I'm in love with Israel. I'm pro-Israel. I've floated in the Dead Sea. I've gone up the cable car to Masada. Those are wonderful, lovely things. But there's really no one other than J Street to do a trip like this, where from a pro-Israel perspective, you walk into some really difficult issues and you take them on. You don't shy away from them. And I'm just so grateful for that. To me, the big takeaway, and I shared this with the group, I think, in our final dinner, the trip, the most emotional moment for me was, coming out of Yad Vashem, when you come up into the light, get ready to go out into the world, and you've just been, filled with all of this information, all of this very heavy, the weight of all of this information about who the victims were and exactly what happened in the Holocaust. And then you walk out into the world, and there was this feeling for me about, what am I going to do with all of this? And to some extent, that's how I felt after this J Street trip. And I don't know all the answers yet. So to answer directly your question about, what we're going to do with all of these things that we've learned and at least come to understand better, I think we're all going to need to kind of work these things out together. I don't know anyone who's figured it all out. And so it's as much a beginning as it is a resolution or an answer to those things for me. But I'm just so grateful to have opened this door. I put this trip off for quite some time, not because I didn't want to do it, but because I think I probably knew it was going to be tough. It was going to challenge me. I needed it, and I'm really grateful and ready to dive into specific questions and issues in ways that I wouldn't have been equipped to do before.
So let me ask you, just getting specific then a little bit. I think one of the most difficult days that we have is the day when we go down towards Hebron, and not only did we walk through the old city, but we also went to the South Hebron Hills and talked to Bedouin residents of a Bedouin village that is near a outpost and has regular outbreaks of violence. In fact, I think, Nate, we may have some pictures of that particular village visit to just pop on the screen at your convenience. But I'm just wondering, if you could share a little bit about your reaction to the visit to the South Hebron Hills. I think it's towards the end. That's actually right there. If you can go back.
That was Hebron, yeah.
Yeah, go back a couple of slides there. Yeah, that, maybe talk for a second about where we are. This is the old city of Hebron.
Yeah, this is a good look at some places that, I guess after the events of 1993, was it? This was just locked down. And the Palestinian residents in many cases, and the shop owners in particular, were just evicted, and a ghost town was created. And the Palestinians that were allowed to continue living there have this surreal arrangement where they literally can't even exit their homes from one side of a street. They have to go out the backside, and their balconies are fortified and kind of blocked off. I think we were told to protect them from settler violence. So it was a very raw and surreal place to walk through. Meanwhile, settlers are coming and going as they please. IDF forces or other police, military type forces are there in large numbers. It's very militarized, checkpoints. But yeah, this is what's left of what I'm told was a pretty bustling commercial district of Palestinians. And I think, Jeremy, on the hill above, you see some, is that the settlement?
Yes, exactly, right, where Nate's moving his cursor. That's actually a settlement in the heart of the old city of Hebron.
So yeah, the contrasts like that are everywhere you go.
And
a lot of newer
flip. Yeah, there's the village.
So the thing that struck me about the village was the incredible mismatch of power, frankly. These, I don't know if we're calling them ranchers or villagers, but the folks that we met with were of the most modest means. I mean, they live a hard scrabble existence. They're barely hanging on, and there's just a few of them. And, you know, they're gradually being pushed out and on an almost daily basis, harassed by these settlers who are showing up and protected, in some cases, even armed, we heard, by IDF. So just the incredible mismatch, the lopsided power relationship is what I took away from that situation.
And I'm really pleased to say that we've been joined by another of your colleagues, Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton from the suburbs of DC, where I live. And you were not my representative, but it's wonderful to have you in a neighboring district. And it was great to travel with you. And welcome to our debrief from the trip. For this, by the way, I would just note for both members of Congress is an on the record, open to the public debrief. So we've got a couple hundred people on the Zoom, and we're recording this, and it's being broadcast on Facebook as well. I know I've been asked by a couple of people in the Q&A who else was on the trip. So before I turn it over to you, Congresswoman, I'll give you a second to collect some thoughts that you might want to share with the group. I did want to share with the people who are on that we had 10 members of Congress. The group was led by Congressman David Price, who is sort of a dean of the delegation in the issues that we work on. He's from North Carolina and is really a leading member of Congress in terms of expertise and experience on these issues. In addition to Congressman Huffman and Congresswoman Wexton, we also had 7 other members: Susan Bonamici from Oregon, Joaquin Castro from Texas, Seth Moulton from Massachusetts, Jason Crow from Colorado, Sean Casten from Illinois, Madeline Dean from Pennsylvania, Lauren Underwood from Illinois. And so it was a wonderful group, and we were there for 5 very full, action-packed days. This is the group in front of the Knesset, where we had a number of meetings one afternoon. With that, by way of a brief bridge to you, Congresswoman, I'd like to turn the microphone over to you if you want to open up with some reflections and thoughts. My cue to Congressman Huffman was what moved him emotionally, and what sort of reached him about this trip that he came back with as a reaction to it.
Well, hey, Jeremy, it's great to be back with you. It's really enjoyed the trip, and it's wonderful to be here with everybody from J Street. And again, my apologies for being late. That's a problem when you're voting proxies for some of your colleagues. It delays your getting out of votes a little bit. But anyway, so yeah, the thing that really moved me really on this trip was just seeing the collective PTSD on both sides of this conflict. You know, we started out by visiting a kibbutz that's on the border of the Gaza envelope, and talking with them about what they deal with all of the rockets landing on their territory, and the fact that these people, when they hear the sirens, they have maybe 15 seconds to go and find shelter. And the thing that really struck me about that was how the young kids in the preschool and the preschoolers and the toddlers, they learn to just, when they hear the sirens, they just put their arms up. Because they know that some adult will scoop them up and carry them running to these shelters. And that's going to definitely, cause some PTSD among these children. Not to mention the kids in the Palestinian territories in the West Bank. The kids that I think Representative Huffman was talking about at the, outside of the settlements, who see their parents and grandparents getting pushed off the land and being chased with dogs, and seeing their livestock being chased off of the lands where they've been grazing for decades and things like that, is very traumatizing for them. But also, for example, we were going to go visit a school, the Hope Flowers School. It's in the Bethlehem area. We weren't able to actually visit the school. I don't know whether anybody has mentioned this yet, but because the day before we were to visit, a young man who was an alumnus of the school, I guess he threw a Molotov cocktail at some IDF soldiers and was shot dead. And things were very tense there in that region because of that. And so, this is what the kids live with on a daily basis. And it was described by the principal of that school as a series of cages. Their life is a series of cages going through various security requirements and checkpoints that they do on a daily basis. So it was really very moving to me just seeing this whole young generation that's growing up with this PTSD, and I just don't know how that's going to impact them as they continue on this journey, and seeing the extremes on both sides really picking up power and driving the narrative, even though the vast majority on both sides really want peace.
One of the things that was said by Congressman Huffman just as you were coming on was that it takes a while to sort of process everything that one sees and goes through, and then to try to sort through what exactly is it that a member of Congress can do, right? What can you actually come back and now begin to put into action from what you saw? And I guess that would be my focus question for both of you in terms of prioritizing the various things that you saw and thinking about where could you put congressional energy to try to push on something that can make a difference? I'm curious if you each have one thing that you came back with that you think you might want to, take on as an issue that you want to try to improve based on what you saw.
Well, I will jump in on that one, Jeremy. Kind of picking up on the lopsided power dynamic between the Palestinians and the settlers that I was talking about before. It manifests itself in some of the most outrageous ways. I mean, Palestinian farmers who can't even get land use approvals to modify their home or to build a home. And yet the system is so stacked in favor of settlers getting whatever they want, even by force. So I think using, our influence, if we can, to bring a little more justice to the system in Israel when it comes to things like that. The home demolitions in Jerusalem and other places are another, really graphic example. And it seems like the only thing that stops that kind of stuff is either the Israeli Supreme Court or the United States Congress when we get engaged. So I think that's one, practical way where we can maybe level the scales of justice a little for these folks.
Congressman?
Well, I agree with everything that Representative Huffman said, and I would add that really, anything that we can do to preserve the viability of a two-state solution, right? Because it's been under attack for quite a while, and it's becoming more and more difficult to foresee, to ever see a time that we will have a two-state solution, certainly in our lifetimes. So I think that another thing that we can do is really to incentivize Palestinian compliance with the Taylor Force Act. Because that's been a real issue. The fact that they have these what are perceived as incentives for people to engage in violent behavior against IDF and violent behavior against Israelis, for things that are suicide bombers and things of that nature. I think that anything we can do to encourage the Palestinians to stop, with that sort of system would be very, very helpful. I think that would be a huge benefit to them, and also would help us be able to get aid to them, because right now there's just a sense of desperation and just a feeling that, nobody's looking out for them right now. Like they're not able to get the assistance that they had previously gotten. They feel that the PA is not really looking out for them, haven't had elections in years. And so there's a desperation. You can see why Hamas won the elections in Gaza, because they just didn't have any other alternatives. So it's really a little bit, disappointing for us to not be able to help them more, but we can't as long as the Taylor Force Act is in effect, and we do need to make sure that they are complying with the requirements of that act.
Yeah, just a thought on that. Sometimes we have to push both sides on the same thing. So we want the Palestinians to have an election. If they don't, they're going to lose credibility with their own constituents if they haven't already done so. But they point to the fact that 200,000 or 300,000 of their voters in East Jerusalem aren't allowed to participate in the election because the Israeli government won't let them. So we're going to have to push Israel on that, as we've had to do before. But you know, there are a few obstacles like this where we've just really got to dig in with both sides.
And that was one of the questions I'm starting to feed into our conversation, the questions that are coming in the Q&A. And so please feel free, folks, to use the Q&A function to shoot questions in. One of the questions was, did you have any contact with the Palestinian leadership, and what was your sense of the leadership? But we also met with Palestinian people, outside of the government structures. And so maybe you might share some impressions of your interactions with Palestinians from the trip. Maybe start with you, Congresswoman.
Well, it was, we went and visited the territories on the West Bank. It was very, very sad to see the encroachment of the settlements onto property that had historically been Palestinian. And so that was very, very disappointing. And just also seeing the kind of despair among a lot of the people there, feeling like nobody was looking out for them or anything. One of the things that was also very interesting to me was we met with a group of young Palestinian activists who just don't even want to dialogue with the Israelis. They just feel like they just want their rights and they want them now, and they don't even want to engage in a dialogue. So that's very concerning to me, because without dialogue, I don't think they're going to be able to have any kind of success. So it is a little bit concerning to see them moving to the fringe as they are, and seeing that on both sides, really. And so I hope that, we can give them some kind of encouragement that there is forward progress in things like a two-state solution.
And Palestinian leadership, Congressman, we did meet with the Prime Minister. I don't know what your thoughts are on that meeting.
Yeah, well, he's got his talking points, I know, and he's very slick and whatnot. But it doesn't help when he dismisses the rockets fire from Gaza and everything as fireworks, right? You can't dismiss the other side's concerns, and he just didn't seem to be really serious about it. But he did have some concerns of his own. I understand that they pay a lot in taxes and don't know where it's going and don't feel like they're getting enough back. But I just think that there's a lot of misunderstandings on both sides, and it would help for them to be able to communicate with one another.
Yeah. You want me to jump in on that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about that is some of his more provocative comments actually came when he met with the AIPAC group, not with us. So that dismissal of Gaza rockets as fireworks, I don't think that was in our meeting. I think that was in what AIPAC experienced. And he also was very provocative with them on apartheid. Now, he brought up apartheid in our meeting. Almost all the Palestinians we brought up used that term and talked a lot about the current state of affairs as being apartheid. So they have clearly decided that that's how they're going to characterize it. They think that's a winning description. But when they met with AIPAC, he went further in response to Hakeem Jeffries, an African-American colleague of ours. He said this is worse than apartheid, and in a way that was fairly provocative and even offended several members that were in attendance. So I don't know why we got him clearly on better behavior in our meeting. He was smooth, he was courteous, I thought, for the most part, and had some pretty compelling answers to most of the tough questions that we threw at him.
So one of the questions that's come up in a few people's comments here is, the two-state solution is an idea that has been around now for many, many decades. If you really go back even before the state of Israel was formed, people started talking about partitioning the land in the 1930s. So we're coming up on a century of talking about this idea of partition, and we're still nowhere near actually getting to two states. And so there are folks in our world who just are saying, is it hopeless? And what else then is there as a way out if you can't separate? And so I'm curious what your take on that is. Do you come back with a sense that we just got to keep working on it? There's really no other way out. Did you see another way besides two states for two people? What's the impact of this trip on your thoughts regarding the ultimate political horizon of getting to two states?
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Well, I just think that two states is the only way that we're going to end up with true peace and harmony in the region. I just don't think that we're going to get it with one state. And one of the things that was really interesting in our trip is that we started with the trip to the Ben Gurion Museum and talked about the origins of Zionism, right? And here in the US and in the West, we kind of, I always was kind of just assumed or was taught that that the state of Israel was created after World War II as compensation for the Jews for the Holocaust, right? To give them a safe haven and a place to live. That is not actually accurate. You know, the Zionist movement had been going on for some time. There's a whole longer history there, obviously. And so that's, you know, very fascinating to me. But the philosophy and everything underpinning Zionism can be also applied to the Palestinians, you know, that they deserve their own state, they deserve their own self-determination, and they deserve to have, you know, to live free and in a way that they are not, you know, they're not second-class citizens. And I think that with a one-state solution, we would not have the Zionist state that I know that Israel wants to be and should be. We also would not have a Palestinian state. So I think that, you know, it's the only way we're going to end up with peace in the region.
Yeah, one of the interesting conversations we had was with a Palestinian scholar, and this I think was in Jerusalem, and he pointed out, you know, there's this conventional narrative out there that Israel is a coherent, you know, state, has always been kind of a state in waiting, and it just makes sense and is quite legitimate as a state. But the Palestinian state concept is a harder sell, doesn't quite fit. You hear all this stuff, you know, they were with Transjordan and all of the history. He helped put this in context by reminding us that most of the states that we have throughout the Middle East and in much of the world are just arbitrary conceptions that are all fairly recent. And the whole identity, the nationalist identity that most people have for their country is relatively recent and, you know, kind of new constructs. Very few long-standing kind of cohesive states in the world. That was helpful to me as we think about this. We're not too far into this project to give Palestinians a national identity. They deserve it. So I agree with Jennifer. I think this thing has to at some point come back to a Palestinian state, even if, you know, what was conceived of in the Oslo Accords seems to be getting undermined in some ways that might be irreparable. And I guess the big takeaway for me, I used to assume that, you know, we had to just have all of these conditions precedent get resolved before we could get to that. I began to think about, you know, whether statehood maybe ought to be front-loaded in that process as a way to resolve many of these other questions. At least it might be that's the only way that we'll ever make it happen.
Well, I think it's really interesting, and you know, it's something that J Street has wanted to generate a little conversation on. Actually, is this notion that the United States perhaps should consider recognition of the state of Palestine without borders at this point, without having resolved the issues, but make it clear that when people are for two states, that there actually is another state, and the United States recognizes that, and the state-to-state negotiations need to resolve the issues. We didn't really get into the trip either, and there's a few questions in the chat about whether the idea of confederation really was something we explored. I think we sort of floated the idea a little bit, but it was that'll be for the next graduate seminar to really get into the details of that. But another line of questioning in the Q&A is something that you all deal with all the time, and Congresswoman in particular, you're on the Appropriations Committee and on the subcommittee that deals with foreign operations and the question of Israel, you know, the aid that we provide to Israel and other countries. And, you know, one of the few tools that's out there, of course, you know, for America expressing its policy preferences and directions and leaning in is the aid. And right. You won't be surprised that there are people in our chat who want to know why we're not cutting off aid. Of course, J Street is not in favor of that. We support the MOU and the provision of security assistance, but there is a question about what that aid goes to. And, you know, I think the line of questioning essentially is, I'll summarize a few questions. What should Congress's role be in overseeing that aid, and how can aid that the United States provides to Israel be used as a sort of lever to push a little bit more towards ending this conflict and not providing a blank check?
Sure, absolutely. And for ever since we started providing this aid, it's basically been a blank check. And I think that, I don't think it's asking too much. I mean, we account for every dime and every penny that we give out to various entities here in the US. So I don't think that it's asking too much for Israel, for the state of Israel, just to report about how they're spending the money that we give them. One of the things that was very concerning to me was seeing the IDF, hearing the stories about the IDF soldiers protecting the settlers as they were coming out and attacking the Palestinians. Now, I don't know whether that's 100% accurate, the stories that we heard, but is it the U.S. support of the IDF that's helping to fuel that, helping to pay for it? And that's something that would be very concerning to me and a lot of my constituents. So I think that even just having the information about where the money that we're giving them is going, I don't think is too much to ask. So I don't believe in conditioning aid. I think that, Israel is our best ally in the region. They need our help and they deserve our help. And a lot of it goes to very good things like the Iron Dome and things of that nature. But I do think that just reporting on how the aid is being spent is not too much to ask. Now, if you try to include that in an appropriations bill, you might encounter some resistance for sure.
Congressman, any thoughts on, I know you're both co-sponsors of Andy Levin's Two-State Solution Act, and there's other bills out there. A couple people have asked about the McCollum bill on child detentions. These are all bills that try to get at that question. What's your take on it, Congressman?
Yeah, so end-use restrictions, I think, is what we call it. And this is not an unusual thing. The United States gives a lot of aid to a lot of different countries. And in many cases, we put restrictions on that. We certainly do it with the Palestinians. I mean, it's been a cutoff of aid until they fix the Taylor Force problem. So I guess the question, if we could have a more honest debate about this, is why would we have a separate set of rules for Israel, where this even more generous aid package that we're happy to provide, because I think Israel's security is going to be a need that we want to support for a long time. But why would we do it without any end-use restrictions, especially as this untenable occupation just goes on and on and on, and with each passing year, it's harder to accept it as a temporary state of affairs. And so I think it's inevitable that we have to kind of force this conversation of end-use restrictions. That's why I was happy to co-sponsor the Levin bill.
There are a number of questions. I don't know whether you all can see the Q&A. Maybe that only I can see it, so I apologize for that. But there's a number of questions that are about AIPAC. And it just so happens, in a coincidental thing, that our delegation of 10 members was staying at a hotel in Jerusalem at the exact same time that a delegation was there with AIPAC. And you mentioned it, Congressman, they met with the Prime Minister. They had a lot of the same meetings with officials. What they didn't see, of course, they didn't go to Hebron, they didn't go to the villages, et cetera. But there are some, questions here about what, your sense is of what your AIPAC colleagues here, and the ones who went, your colleagues that, I'm not going to call them your AIPAC colleagues, that's an incorrect thing, the colleagues that went with the AIPAC group, what was your interaction with them? Have you had conversations with people who took other trips? There was also an AIPAC Republican trip, I would note. So there were 3 groups. I'd say you could have had a quorum of the U.S. Congress probably in the lobby bar of our hotel and, rewritten the Constitution or something, but we could have had quite a meeting in our lobby. What was the interaction like between the different groups?
Well, I don't know about you, Jennifer, but I only had limited social time with our colleagues who were on the AIPAC trip. I ran into Mike Levin a couple times in the hotel lobby. I ran into Brad Schneider. We did kind of compare notes on our meeting with the Palestinian president, because I think we had met very close in time. We'd both been to Ramallah. And there was an interesting moment on that where, the fight that Palestinian president had with Hakeem Jeffries over apartheid. When I mentioned to Brad that he had used the same term in our meeting, and he asked if I took him to task for that. And I said, no, I just listened on that. And, he's entitled to his characterization. And he told me how disappointed he was that we had not, fought with the Palestinian president over the use of that term. And as you know, Jeremy, I continued to struggle. I do still with, where does that term fit into our characterizations and our conversation about the occupation. I understand there are distinctions, but I also think there seems to be a concerted effort on the Palestinian side to use that term more and more, and a similar effort on the other side, I suppose, to say you can't ever use that term. That's like a third rail, and you're not even allowed to say it or even compare it. So somewhere in between these two things, there's a really interesting conversation about how we characterize the occupation and to some extent, the parallels we can draw to apartheid.
Congressman, were you down at the bar at all for the interaction?
No, I wasn't. And in fact, there are two different rooms where you can have breakfast in the hotel where we stayed. And for some reason, J Street was always in one of the rooms and AIPAC was always in the other. But one morning, my colleaague Abigail Spanberger from Virginia was on the AIPAC trip, and we both have the same AIPAC contact, and we all had breakfast together in the AIPAC area. And I don't know why, it's just, I don't think that AIPAC and J Street necessarily have to be considered working at cross purposes, because in a lot of things we agree. But, so it was very pleasant to have breakfast with them. And we just seems like their trip was a little bit more, enjoying all that Israel has to offer and a little bit less of the deep dive into the actual conflict. Yeah. So, and even the things where they did, go to the same sort of destinations that we did, and where they learned about things that we did, they definitely had a different take on them. The what was it, the 301, the around Jerusalem, the highway there, the 310 or whatever it was. Their whole issue is security concerns. Everything's about security, and less so about, it all comes down to Israeli security as the overarching concern, and there's not as much discussion of what the effect it has on the Palestinians as a result of those concerns.
And the exchange I share with Brad is meant to suggest maybe there was just a different culture in our two trips. They were there to some extent to sort of do pro-Israel combat. And I think we were there to listen and learn. And that conversation highlighted that distinction for me a little bit.
And I will say one thing, that's just as an aside, the food is amazing in Israel, absolutely amazing. Yeah. And I wish that somebody would make me Israeli salad for breakfast every day, but unfortunately I haven't had any since I came back, but wonderful, absolutely delicious.
Yeah, no, one of the things that I think is difficult, as somebody who is very deeply tied to Israel and feels so strongly about the good things about the country, it is always hard to run a trip that you're basically spending a lot of your time focusing on the things that are wrong, and you don't get enough time to really focus on the good side of things. And it's not our intent to imply there aren't the good things. It's just that we're focused on this conflict, which is eating away at Israel's very.
It's interesting you mentioned that, Jeremy, because there was a young staffer on the J Street trip, Halit, I think her name is, and she's a young Israeli woman, and she said it's always hard for her going on this trip because it's hard for her to show people who aren't from Israel, the bad things that her country does, because she loves it so much. And I think, one of the things that I told her, and I think that other people on the trip felt the same way. I also fell in love with her country. I really did. And I want it to be the best country it can be, and I want it to live up to its ideals. And I think that the only way that they're going to do that is by getting lasting peace with the Palestinians, and by truly being a liberal democracy, and by truly living up to their ideals. So, I think that it was nice to see the young generation expressing these concerns and loving their country, despite warts and all, as they said.
Yeah, and the Breaking the Silence group was even more so, I think, in that spirit. I mean, folks who had served Israel, who, as they explained it to us, were willing to kill and die for Israel, but wanted to tell the honest story about this occupation. That was an eye-opener.
And I glanced at the chat and I saw that there was a question about the young IDF soldiers who are forced to go into the territories and strong arm the Palestinians and everything. And it truly does. I mean, this Breaking the Silence group, is made up of a lot of people. It's kind of a support group for the former soldiers who were really traumatized by what they had to endure. One of the things that really struck me when we went to visit the Iron Dome site was just how young these kids are. They're like
babies,
19 years old. They're just so young, and that's the thing that is just so very, very striking for me to see that they're just so young.
I just want to make due note that somebody made a comment that there's a Palestinian cuisine and culture as well. We
Oh,
did
yeah,
eat a wonderful meal in East Jerusalem Palestinian restaurant,
that's right. We did. That was delicious too. Yeah.
and the food.
I will tell everybody that, you know, my desert island my desert island food would have been Lebanese back in the day, but now I think it's just Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean. So
It's all great.
yeah.
Question on the issue of the consulate that came up a fair amount as we were going around, and you know, the United States has had a facility in Jerusalem since the 1850s, and Donald Trump came along and sort of took the sign down and removed the direct diplomatic relationship that the U.S. had with the Palestinians. And Joe Biden, during his campaign, did promise to reopen that, and it hasn't happened yet. We're 14 months in. Just curious, people are curious, and I'm curious, you know, what your take on the importance of reopening that consular facility, not necessarily the building, but really the relationship, direct relationship for the State Department with the Palestinians.
Yeah, and we asked Ambassador Nides about this, and he was very hesitant to come out on either side. I mean, he expressed that he was concerned about escalating the situation in the region. He was concerned about, you know, causing people to be you know, very you know, backlash about it, kind of thing. But, you know, this is something that Joe Biden promised on the campaign trail, and people are going to hold him to it. And I think it would go a long way to helping to show that we, you know, that we still support the viability of a two-state solution. I think it's probably the single most important thing we can do at this time. So I still think it should happen. Now, we are only in quarter one of a four-quarter game, but still, I think.
Or 8 quarters, perhaps.
You never know.
Hoping for 8 quarters.
Yeah.
And Congressman Huffman, any thoughts on the consulate?
Yeah, so Jennifer was maybe a little more charitable than I would be in describing how Ambassador Nides responded to our question. And you were there. I don't want to get you or J Street in any kind of trouble because he graciously took our meeting, and he's a friend, I think, of the organization and of many members of Congress. But I was disappointed, quite honestly, in his unwillingness to have a more proactive agenda on some of these things. You know, we were told that, you know, if there's too much pushing on any of these things, it could compromise this fragile coalition government in Israel, and that has to be the top consideration. And I think some of us bristled at that. Why would Israeli politics be the top consideration for our administration and for our ambassador on the ground? Why not our values and our agenda? And we, as I told him, I understand you got to pick your fights, but pick some fights. And I didn't hear any. So
I fail to understand why they believe that this would cause that coalition to break up. You know, I mean, it's like, I just don't understand how our actions would affect that.
Yeah.
And, you know, I do want to assure, we've got a couple hundred folks watching here on the Zoom, and there's other folks that are on Facebook, and people will watch this on tape. I just want to go on record and say that our delegation in all of the meetings, whether it was with Israeli officials or Palestinian officials or American officials, that you all pushed very hard, you know, appropriately and politely, but hard on all of the different parties to this, about the things that they do and the policies. And I think one of the reactions the J Street leadership comes away from these congressional delegations, this one and others, is just the deep admiration and respect for all of you and the way that you carry out your roles and push as possible and push as necessary, and really appreciate that very much.
And I do want to say about Ambassador Nides is that, you know, he may not be going as far as a lot of us want, but he is trying to do things to make tangible difference in the lives of the Palestinians. He says one of his top goals is to get them 4G, right? They don't even have 4G right now, which is something that will really improve the quality of their lives quite a bit. So, you know, he's focusing on tangible deliverables that he can do without rocking the boat too much, it seems. So
I have no doubt that his values and his heart are all in the right place. It was the agenda that I think needs some further conversation. And just to round out the view you were just talking about, Jeremy, we also held the Palestinians that we talked to a high standard of scrutiny, and the president of the PA in particular, when he defined their victims compensation program, He was very euphemistic about it, and we did press him on that. You can't characterize it as a social security type of safety net program if it's only being offered, when there are these crimes that are committed. You're not offering it when somebody loses a family member in a car accident or some disability. So we did press on that, and I came away thinking that at least there's some hope that they might reform that program in the way we pushed and described.
So we've got just a few minutes left. I know we're aiming to wrap up at 6. You have a hard stop. So one of the, again, themes in the Q&A is the question of whether or not at this point Israel itself can be considered a democracy. The labels that you've been discussing that J Street doesn't use, considering to describe Israel, but that are used sometimes to describe the situation on the West Bank. Some organizations extend them to within Israel itself, questioning whether Israel itself is a vibrant democracy. We met with Mansour Abbas, who's the head of the Arab party that's now in the coalition. We met with parties all over the map, of the Israeli political spectrum. I'm curious your perception of Israeli democracy, not vis-a-vis the occupation, which I think we can agree off the bat is a violation of international law and is a violation of human rights, but within Israel proper, your perception of Israeli democracy these days?
Well, by Middle Eastern standards, it is very much of a thriving, robust democracy. There's no doubt about it. There is free speech, there is freedom of expression, there is, an independent judiciary that actually does stuff to protect people's rights. So, many of the key pillars of democracy are alive and well in Israel. And by the way, I think all of us these days bring a lot of humility to this question because our democracy is on shakier ground than we would like. No, I definitely see a democratic republic in the state of Israel, not perfect, but there are also warning signs, I think, with Israeli democracy, much like what we're seeing here. There's a real authoritarian drift. There is religious extremism that is beginning to drive political agendas in some ways that I don't think will end well. So I'm concerned about that direction.
Yeah, and I would concur with everything that Jared just said. And I just add that the governing coalition that they have in place right now is a perfect example of just how their democracy is working. It took a while to get there, but it's held together very well. It's been pretty sturdy so far, and it's a very interesting collection of interests all working together to hopefully make their union a stronger one.
So I'll throw a final question your way, which was actually one of the first questions asked, and I thought it's a great one to close on, and you can use it then to say whatever you'd like as by way of closing. I'd also say that a lot of questions that are in the chat are really fact questions about the occupation and all the rest of it, and J Street's going to be engaging in a very significant public education campaign to try to bring some of the things that you all saw to the United States and particularly to Congress through a wide range of different media in the coming year, because we think there is just a lack of understanding of all these things. And so what you've seen, I hope your colleagues will see, not just by personally visiting, but through our work. But the final question that I want to give you as a cue for closing thoughts is, what's the most important change in your perception of the situation that came as a result of this trip?
Well, I'll go ahead and Jennifer can hit cleanup here. I don't want to end on a downer. I always like to leave hope, but quite honestly, one of the big takeaways for me is that the two-state solution is in deep trouble. And it's not just the settlers or settler violence or other problems that I think I kind of knew were undermining it. It is the loss of credibility on the Palestinian side, and the fact that the younger generation of Palestinians is kind of just moving on and fairly locked into this rights-based approach to realizing their aspirations, and they're not buying it. They think the two-state solution has been a giant bait and switch, that they've got nothing since Oslo, that their leaders have sold them out, that Israel never intended to make good on this. So I'm not hugely hopeful that we can put this thing together. But at the same time, no one has been able to articulate a better way to solve this conflict. So I feel like we've got to keep at it and see if we can't find a way to get things back to at least some notion of statehood for these folks so we can move on and try to resolve the other issues.
And Congresswoman, you get the final words here.
I think for me, in addition to everything that Jared just said, it's also that you really have to see it to understand fully, you know, because you can learn about it. People can tell you about the settlements. People can tell you about West versus East Jerusalem and everything. But until you actually see it with your own eyes and you walk those streets with your own feet, you just don't understand. You just don't get it. And having the opportunity to talk with people from such a broad variety of ideological positions really was something that I could not have ever foreseen, actually having that ability and having that, you know, that perspective come to me. So that was the thing that was most fascinating for me, but I am very concerned about the future of a two-state solution. And that's why I think that we need to do whatever we can to make sure that it remains viable.
Well, I certainly am glad that sense of urgency came across. We share that sense that action is needed. We hope that your colleagues that will enlist you as ambassadors to your colleagues to get more of them to come and see this through the lens that we are able to present, and then hopefully come back and unite around some actions that need to be taken to keep the hope alive or even to create it in the first place. So thank you both for the incredible dedication of time to this issue that you put in, given everything else that's going on in the world. And we're very grateful for your leadership and your friendship, and look forward to continuing to work with you.
Thank you. It was a great trip. Really appreciate it.
Thanks to you both. Thanks, everyone.